All right, 10 o'clock straight up. Time to get started. I have been living now with Psalm 18 all week, and I am so pleased that we have today to do it as part 3 and to hear your voices reacting to some of the psalm. As I noted yesterday, this psalm is in rabbinic tradition called Shirat David, the Song of David. That's parallel to the great song of the sea, the song of liberation that the Israelites sang, chapter 15 of Exodus, in reaching the shores of freedom. This too is a celebration of redemption. This is David's great song in which both he was delivered from Saul and all his enemies. As I noted yesterday, this psalm uniquely is repeated or found, maybe even before, in Scripture, in Tanakh, in the second book of Samuel, chapter 22. They're exactly the same number of verses, that being 51, making this the fourth longest psalm of the 150 psalms. King David yesterday was our focus in terms of getting a feel for how he, as a young man, was a singer, or at least a musician, and once he became king, became at many points in his life in close connection to God and also doing so lyrically. But this is his longest expression of gratitude to God, his song of deliverance. And today we'll look at some of the differences, those small, significant, between Samuel 2:22 and as it is in Psalm 18. But before I begin, I am so honored as I look here at our Hollywood squares to see each of you and to know that many of you have expertise in aspects of what we're engaged with now as a collective, and that's reading carefully. And in that regard, I want to start with Hal Levitt and an email he sent me yesterday, in which he writes as follows. Harold Bloom, my favorite literary critic, in his late book, The Shadow of a Great Rock, writes, of all the figures in Tanakh, David seems the most Shakespearean, inward and multi-selved. As with Shakespearean protagonists, most endless to meditation, David cannot be thought through, since always there is more to be considered. David anticipates Hamlet as a masterpiece of contraries, but David is also a religious figure, which may make him even more complex. The biblical David is an incarnate poem. I love that last line. The biblical David is an incarnate poem. And again, a poem is a writing of contradictions, of multiple possibilities of interpretation. And so that's the nature of David and clearly of David's writings. And so I want to now quote another one of our participants. Many of us know Ahuva to be the great Bible scholar and author that she is. Again, looking out at each of you, wind in my sails. So Ahuva wrote me yesterday, and she said, years ago, which was 2001, I presented a paper at the SBL, the Society for Biblical Literature Convention, in which I showed that Psalm 18 was David's attempt to convince the Israelite tribes that he, like Moses, was chosen by God to unite all the tribes into one kingdom under, of course, the Davidic leadership. I found the psalm to be authentic to David, in which he described his political platform. Since David and Judah did not share the Israelite tradition of Sinai and the Exodus, David shows his willingness to adapt the Northern historical traditions. Now, Ahuva teaches on Sunday at the moment a class on reading Nevi'im and Ketuvim through modern lenses. Ahuva, and I keep pointing at her on my screen, Ahuva has the historical lens that there's a history, a very different way of understanding the authorship, of seeing a political agenda. So I'm going to read just a little bit more from Ahuva's paper, and then we'll get rolling analyzing the psalm on its own terms, somewhat. Back to Ahuva. The setting of Psalm 18 is in the early days of David's kingship. Saul and his heir are dead, and the young nation is on the verge of a civil war or a return to a tribal system. External threat is still palpable. No spiritual leader has replaced Samuel to fill the people with political and religious hope. The only warrior who has proven himself against foreign powers is David. He had been crowned over his tribe of Judah and had married into the legitimate royal family. Political maneuvers with the royal tribe of Benjamin put him on the throne over Israel. But this was not enough to secure his position among all of Israel. And here comes the intention of Psalm 18. David and the Judahite needs to tap into the Israelite tradition for legitimization and acceptance. He does this by comparing himself to the Exodus leader par excellence, Moses in his personal life from birth through his travails against an oppressive and mighty force. They both experienced God's theophany and personal support. They both fought external and internal foes and prevailed. Moses shaped a nation at Sinai out of diverse groups, and David is hoping to do the same. Furthermore, David is portraying himself as an individual who embodies the collective Israelite suffering, fear, and hope. In short, this composition is a political propaganda in which David seeks legitimacy by presenting himself as the only viable heir to Moses, as a national unifier selected by God himself. One last prompt among those in our Zoom group was a conversation that I had yesterday with Rochelle, who is a poet. And she said to me, in looking at Psalm 18, what struck me are these remarkable anthropomorphisms, these remarkable ways in which God is described in human-like ways. And so there too, I return to Exodus 15, Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea. And I reread it in anticipation and in response to Rochelle's observation. And I just want to share some images, and then I'll pull this piece together. That again comes, Exodus 15, as the Israelites have reached the shores of freedom. Sus v'rachmo ramavayam, horse and chariot, God threw into the sea. Chadonai tiratz oyev, your right hand shatters the foe. Verse 8, uvaruach hapecha nermu mayim, and the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. We'll return to that imagery in our psalm of the blasts of God's nostrils. So you already see that kind of human qualities of God as warrior in this original song of deliverance. And then, not unlike our psalm, praise of God, parallel language. Micha mocha be'elim Adonai, who is like among the gods, Adonai. You'll see that same in 18 kind of phrasing. And back to the anthropomorphism. Natita yimincha tivla'ema aretz. You put out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. And words of celebration. Shiru ladonai, let us sing to God. Ki ga'ol ga'ah, for God has triumphed. Sus v'rachmo ramavayam. Repeating verse 1 back to an envelope, verse 1 and verse 21, which is Miriam's refrain. Horse and chariot he threw into the sea. And so what we have in Psalm 18 And Ahuva develops it much more. And I'm sure Ahuva would share her essay with you if you would like. Let me know, or let Ahuva, and I'll send you her essay, which is in significant part comparing Psalm 18 and Exodus 15 as songs of deliverance. And you can understand why. Ahuva focuses on a historical moment of David needing, after Saul has died, and that's the introduction, right? This is a song of celebration after God saved David from the palm of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. That's the first line. And yet simultaneously, this appears in the book of Samuel right toward the end of David's life. And I shared already how the rabbis harmonized that tension by saying he wrote it early and continued to sing it as a song of deliverance. And what I have my eye on in today's class, in a little conversation at the end, is how are these words relevant to us? Ultimately, these psalms are meant to be our words, our prayers. This is the Jewish people's playlist, but not just to listen to hear a resonance of the past, but to find in these words voice for our own yearnings. And this psalm in particular, this long psalm, is presented in our tradition as what we should share and say to celebrate our own deliverance, our own experience of a miracle of safety, Psalm 18. So now let me talk about some aspects of the psalm. And that is, first, how it's divided. I mentioned this the first time, but I want to go back and look at it as literary structure to convey what is it that David is seeking to convey. Verses 1 to 4 are praise for deliverance. And the words in verses 1 to 4 will be repeated in verses 47 to 51. Certain words that'll be repeated over and over are God's name, and words like Hitzil, save, Oivav, his enemies, Elid Suri, my God, my rock, Yishi, my savior, my deliverer, Ovai Ivashea, from my enemies I am saved. Those exact words will be repeated in the closing, verses 47 to 51. And my image is this is a very big frame. It's a very big song of celebration and a very big frame. In between verses 5 to 20, which is a big chunk, is a description of David's fear of death. His enemies surround him, confronted by the snares of death. And then that pivotal line, verse 17, God reached from on high, took me, pulled me out of the mighty waters. Verse 20, taking me into a wide open space, setting me free because God desires me. And so this sense of near-death experience is verses 5 to 20, which will leave us with the question that I've presented. Is this part of a dream of David, or is this simply poetic metaphor? The third section is verses 21 to 25, which is unusual in that it's a description of personal merit. For I have kept the ways of Adonai, and I have not betrayed my God. For all God's ordinances are before me, and God's statutes, and I do not turn away from me. And I, veheyet tamim imo, I am wholehearted with God. And then verses 26 to 46 are both praise, but a particular kind of praise. It's acknowledging that God, midah keneged midah, that's the rabbinic phrase for measure to measure. God, with the pure, you act purely, but with the obstinate, you are wryly. Verse 26, I'm going back. With merciful, you deal mercifully. With the wholehearted person, you show yourself wholeheartedly. And I love verse 29. For you light up my lamp, Adonai. My God illuminates my darkness. It's praise, but it's also empowerment. For he, the Psalter, will say, verse 41, you have made my enemies present their necks to me, and those that hate me I have demolished. They shall cry out, but none shall deliver, even to Adonai, who will not respond to them. I shall grind them up as windswept dust, as muck on the streets. I shall tread on them. And in that sense, this next piece is about the Psalter's military might. And in some ways, and Ahuva pointed this out, it uses language from the Song of the Sea in terms of verse 38. He says of himself, this is the Psalter, Erdof ovai va'asigem, I shall pursue my enemies and overtake them. In the Song of the Sea, we had that same resonant language, but it was a description of God. Amar oyev erdof asik, or at least this is what the enemies say. I'm sorry. This is what the enemies say about Israel. They say, I will pursue and I will overtake them. So we have the echo of Psalm 15 and the language of the enemies. But here in verse 38, it is David who is the one who has the might to pursue the enemy and overtake. So there's this echoing of the Song of the Sea, but this quality of it's unlike the Song of the Sea. This is now David with the power, godlike power over his enemies. And then the closing again, verse 47. Chai Adonai, Adonai lives. Uvaruch Tsuri, blessed is my rock. Ve'yarum Elohei Yishi, exalted is my God, my deliverer. Michamocha be'elim Adonai, not unlike earlier in the Song of the Sea, who is like God among the gods. And so in terms of imagery, this psalm is resonant with remarkable images of God's power and God's empowerment. One image that I actually chose from which to call this Soaring Deliverance is the image of God being taken up. One second. I'm looking for the verse of God going up in the chariot with the Kruvim. I took so many notes, I had to reprint it. Verse 11, and a comment on verse 11. By the way, you can see in my translations, I prefer not to use pronouns for God, so it feels more resonant to a contemporary ear. So in verse 11, I put in parentheses God instead of and he mounted upon a cherub. V'yirkav al kruv v'ya'of, and he mounted on a cherub and flew. V'yedeh al kanfei ruach, soaring upon the wings of the wind. That's quite a remarkable image of God and the cherub. So now I'm going to transition to some of these comments of the differences between the two, Samuel and here. But first, a comment about cherubs. And that is, we tend to think of cherubs as these sweet, baby-faced images. And he's mounting here in war on the wings of a cherub. And indeed, in the Talmud, they'll do an Aramaic wordplay, karavaya, which sounds very similar, which is how you say kruv, which is cherub, kruv in Hebrew. In Aramaic is karavaya, which can also mean like a youngster. And clearly in medieval Christian art, the cherub is sweet. But in Canaanite mythology, Robert Alter points out, a cherub is a fierce-winged beast of the sky, a kind of god in Canaanite mythology. So it's not clear which is being referred to. Back to Robert Alter and his translation. Here's a difference between the two. Verse 11. Here it's Vayedeh, and he soared on the wings of the wind. In chapter 22 of Samuel, it's Vayera al Kanfei Ruach, and he saw the wings of the wind. And Alter will assert that that's a scribal error, that it should have read, he surmising that Samuel is the original, Vayera instead of Vayedeh. I'm not so sure. And here's why I think that that might be not the only way to understand it. Vayedeh is a more obscure term. If you're a scribe, you're going to pick the more common word. And so it would be Vayera more likely than Vayedeh. This being, in his mind, Psalm 18, the secondary text. So here's another example where Professor Alter asserts scribal error. Verse 14, you get the repetition of Barad v'gacha le'esh, and the Most High gave forth voice, hailstones and coals of fire. He asserts that the repetition of 13 and 14 of hailstones and coals of fire is a scribal error. Two last ones in terms of a difference. Verse 36, I translated as follows. And you have given me your shield of deliverance, your right hand aids me, and your humility has made me increasingly great. Here's the difference of words between the two. In the book of Samuel, instead of humility, it's battle cry. It's anotecha instead of anvatecha. It's the difference of that vav being a yud, anavtecha and anotecha. He says, Alter, that it makes more sense to see this as in the book of Samuel, as a battle cry, because this is a verse that describes what God is giving David for battle. He's giving him a shield and a right hand and a battle cry. I mean, he's giving him a bow of bronze, verse 35, a shield and a battle cry, 35 and 36 together. But I tend to think that the psalmist might have chosen to use the word humility instead of battle cry, precisely because they're so close. Because this particular segment of the psalm deals with God's empowerment of David. So it is in God's humility that he makes David great, God-like in battle. It can be, of course, either one. But I'll just pull this together. Oh, there's one more. And as I see my friend, Rabbi Podwal, I'm always so reminded to double check where this might be linked to prayer. Look at the very last verse. Here it's Magdil Yeshuot Malko, making great rescues of God. In the book of Samuel, it's not Magdil, it's Migdol, which is more passive, having made great rescues of God's king. And interestingly, it's a line toward the end of Birkat Hamazon. And on Shabbat, we do the passive Migdol. And during the week, we use the active Magdil. And the commentaries are on Shabbat, we are to see, everything in place, back to the passive, during the week to be active. It's another example of a difference between the texts that later will get harmonized. Few closing thoughts, and then I'll open it up for some reactions, and we'll go over a little bit. Repeated words, enemy, 6 times, rescue, 6 times, shield, 4 times. This is about fights, deliverance. David, throughout his life, was a king of battles. And this song of David is the song of deliverance against enemies, with God's rescue, with the shield. But what is dramatic and so artistic in this psalm are the sounds. Well, I have to do just a little bit of a sound. I reread this morning in both Hebrew and English so that it would be resonant. And as I reread it, I was made all the more aware of how it is rhythmic. Listen to one verse, verse 3. Adonai sal'i umitsudati umifalti eli tsuri echesebo magini v'keren yishi miskabi. That's just one verse. So in the Hebrew, there is this rhythmic quality, even kind of a military quality. You can see all those E's, and all those E's represent the word me or my. That word is repeated 9 times in this psalm. It's deeply personal. It's David's expression of redemption, deeply personal. And I chose to call it Soaring Deliverance because it does have this sense of being brought into wide open spaces of redemption, of God reaching in with verse 17. God reached from on high, took me, pulled me out of the mighty waters, saving me from my strong enemy and from those who hate me, for they were too powerful for me. This is soaring images of God up above, not only saving David, but empowering David. With that, I am tempted to keep talking, and there's so much more to say. 32 means lave. We have 32 screens. Lave is heart. I'm going to go over because it's the last time today. You know, I always try to stay within the half hour, but I do want to go over because it's a long psalm, 51 verses. It took most of the first session just to read it, and I haven't had a chance to hear your voices. So what I'd ask you to respond to is, what's an image that grabbed you in hearing this psalm of deliverance? We'll take 10 minutes. I'll then pull it together with answering, is this a dream, or is this only poetic metaphor or not? And I'll tell you how Rabbi Martin Cohen related to it. So with that, we have such a rich audience of readers. What in this psalm of deliverance, this soaring deliverance, grabs you? One comment, unmute yourself to share.
Well, for 2,000 years.
Wait, first identify yourself.
This is Shalom Padwal.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi Padwal.
So for 2,000 years, this is, I'm saying, just a dream, because for 2,000 years of powerlessness and without any power, without any homeland, persecution, 2,000 years, how do we read this? Victorious, God is victorious, David is victorious, and we are downcast. I mean, for 2,000 years, this must be just a unattainable dreamland.
That's beautifully said. Let me reframe it and react. Rabbi Padwal says this psalm, as all the psalms, for 2,000 years of dispersion, were our words of community. But these words for 2,000 years as a homeless people could have only been read as a dream, as a longing, as a hope of empowerment, of redemption. And in that regard, whether it was a dream of redemption that prompted the writing, redemption itself, what is clear is that these words did provide for Jews a quality of the hope of empowerment, of being mighty, of being even God-like in term with God's help of reclaiming that land. And so as to emphasize, and I'm again thinking of Ahuva having delivered a paper on this specific psalm so many years ago, this is a pivotal moment in David's life. Other reactions?
Okay, Richard Henley.
Great, go ahead, Richard. Good to see you. Richard Henley.
Yes, good to see everybody too. One of the things that strikes me about the psalm is that it seems to be driving towards verse 50. It's as if what he's saying is setting the stage so that he can make that statement. Therefore, I shall give thanks to you among the nations, Adonai, and to your name I will sing. And that seems to be one of the driving points for, and understanding all of the somewhat difficult sections maybe that he's put those in so that he can make that statement the way he's making it. Anyway,
So I want to build on Richard's insight that there is this sense of the psalmist wanting to express God's glory and God's magnificence. Here, I didn't emphasize it before, but it resonates with Richard's comment. Verse 32, Ki mi Elohai mi biladi Adonai umi tzuri zulati Eloheinu. And this is like the mi chamocha, the who is like God from the Song of the Sea. Here, verse 32, for who is God with a small g, except Adonai, rhetorically asked, and who is a rock? Only our God. So there is throughout, and all the more in the opening and closing, lofty expression of who is like God. You are so magnificent. And all the battle gives context for why those words soar. So back to the resonance with chapter 15 in Exodus, and back to the key feeling of reading the Song of the Sea is the praise of God. And that's very much here in this Psalm 18. Another reaction? Ahuva, since I quoted you earlier, anything you would want to add about Psalm 18? You got to unmute yourself. Wait, Ahuva, let me unmute you. Okay, go ahead, Ahuva.
I said I have nothing else to add. You read what I said, and I said it all. You read it well.
Thank you. So with that, I'll give one more chance if anybody has anything to say, and then I'll pull this together. So let me begin. Vivian, did you want?
I was struck by the focusing slowly in on the individual, from the entire universe, from the world that we saw, to coming together to the singular, to the person or voice of the psalmist. And that movement from the whole, well, it's not universe, the whole world as we see it, concentrating in on that voice, made it feel as if it were the power.
That's a very powerful insight, Vivian. And I want to use that to draw all this together. As Vivian says, and it builds off of Richard's piece, on one hand, we have this song of praise of God as being unique in creation, the creator who controls nature, who can enter into history and redeem. And that's this praise of the Almighty, El Elyon. And yet At the same time, as Vivian highlights, there is this constant refrain of, God, you did this for me. You paid attention to an individual amidst your creation. Somebody who loves you, you have returned the love and saved me from my enemies and have empowered me to be able to bend the bow of brass. You have made my feet run without tripping. You have done that, God, for me. And so this is a deeply personal expression of gratitude, but more, it's a description of the Almighty as concerned with the individual, particularly the individual who is immoral, because that is part of this psalm. Those who are crafty, you will deal with wily, meaning you're paying attention to the bad and you're giving them their just deserts, and you honored and loved me because I am your lover. I am true to your teachings and way. And so that contrast between the Almighty who cares for the individual, the Almighty who acts justly, measure for measure, responding in kind. Back to the image of my teacher and friend, Rabbi Cohen. Rabbi Cohen, in his book on Psalms, tries to personalize the Psalms and says, you know, how can we use this Psalm? As Rabbi Podwal said, this Psalm for 2,000 years has been used by the Jewish people as a dream looking forward. We are dreaming about our potential power. For Rabbi Cohen, this potentially is a dream looking backwards, that the psalmist had these images in the midst of his fights, of his fears, in which God on the chariot, in which God volcano-like, with fire, with brimstone, with power, these images that are dream-like, was there to support him. And awakening, maybe more than one dream, but having, for Rabbi Cohen, these mystical experiences of closeness to God, which is what David yearned for, closeness to God, that closeness to God gave David these mystical experiences that put confidence and power behind his human capacity. And that too is celebrated here. That might be possible. Rabbi Cohen challenges his readers to say, have you ever had a mystical experience? Have you ever had a dream in which you found a source of strength, a voice of comfort? And he says, we in the modern world are often uneasy with this kind of experience, but for him, that prompts the Psalter. It's not clear to me, but I can relate to that too. And last, going back to Ahuva's teaching this morning, and that is the Bible, all the more 2 Samuel 22 has a historical context. Saul has died. David, and the rabbis also identify this being written in the aftermath of Saul's death. In fact, the rabbis will chastise King David for celebrating Saul's death in this psalm. But that's one dimension. But the other dimension is David has not yet, when Saul dies, become the king immediately. And this psalm does make him Eved Hashem. That expression here David is called in the opening, verse 1, for the conductor, for the servant of Adonai, for David. Who else is called the servant of God? Moses. And it's used, I think, also for Aaron. It's a unique expression of power, of closeness to God. And uniquely, this psalm ends with verse 51, making reference to 2 Samuel 20 of God's making God great rescue of God's king, keeping faith with God's anointed, with David and his descendants forever, highlighting that God has chosen David, not only opening with the word David, closing with the word David, saying David is God's anointed. And so multifaceted. It's the opening quote of Hal's that he shared with us from Professor Bloom. I'm going to read it again and then last word. But David is also a religious figure, which may make him even more complex. The biblical David is an incarnate poem. David's life is complex. This magnificent psalm, truly magnificent, is so multifaceted, so complex. Praise and personal deliverance. Next week, I'll try to stick to one psalm. Psalm 19, the next one, is a psalm. There's more than one, but the first in our series that Bach wrote a cantata for. Hashemayim misaprim kavod el. The magnificence of the heavens declare God's greatness, God's glory. That's the line that Bach turned into a cantata. I'll play that. It'll be part of my email to you if you want to hear the music that Bach heard in reading Psalm 19. I'll look to see you on Tuesday when we continue our journey through Psalms. My gratitude to each of you for tuning in. Have a good day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.